So how would we define life then, effectively?
I think that is something that is so heavily debated. I think the main clincher is the presence of DNA, because viruses, they're one of the most fickle things, because they don't have a nucleus, and they do have DNA of sorts.
They have RNA, don't they?
Yeah, they have RNA, but they do reproduce using DNA, because they latch onto cells, well, they go inside our cells, and they use our DNA.
They use our DNA to reproduce. But by most, in fact, all scientists' definition of life, those rocks are alive.
It's now the Monster Mash.
The Monster Mash.
And it's a graveyard smash.
It's now the mash.
It's caught on in a flash.
It's now the mash.
Hello and welcome to Joel and Josh's Amazing Creatures,
where we take your fantasies and drag them grotesquely through reality.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Joel.
And in today's episode, we're going to be getting a little bit spooky. Way after Halloween and near Christmas with Joel and Josh's Nightmare Before Christmas episode, Vampires. Now, this is usually where I would talk a little bit about the origins of vampires, but I'm going to be real with you guys, I'm just not going to bother.
Because vampires are such a widely spread myth.
They're such a widely spread and well established that tracking down their origins is actually nearly impossible. Like, it's theorized that it's either Asia or Eastern Europe.
Yeah, and when we say Eastern Europe, we do not mean Transylvania.
Because Transylvania was not... And then there's the whole Vlad the Impaler thing of people going, oh, that might be where it came from.
It was before then, definitely.
Yeah. So basically, there's so much different about vampires. Vampires are such a staple in popular media as well nowadays. So I think one of the best things to start with where we're going with our vampires is first of all starting with what we are not going to be covering. And the first one is just out of sheer biological impossibility, our vampires are not going to be able to turn into bats. You can't change your species, no matter what Tumblr tells you. We're not going to allow them to suddenly, just conservation of mass, for example.
But in Bram Stoker's Dracula, he doesn't just turn into a bat, he also turns into
a wolf, doesn't he?
A wolf and a cloud of green mist.
So
He's not going to do that.
So yeah, we're definitely not having our vampire shape-shifting, unfortunately. There's also a few other things we aren't going to do either, is there?
Because there are laws of physics, we're not going to do the whole thing about them not having reflections.
We're also going to avoid the trope of they're not being allowed inside the house without being invited, because if there's one thing that nature's taught us is that nature does not care for your mannerisms. There's also stuff like being scared of crucifixes we're not going to do. And I
think Richard Dawkins does that though.
And in terms of being staked through the heart being a way to kill it, that's pretty much a good way to kill pretty much anything. We're not going to have it specifically die from that. We can try, but there is a few things we are going to do. We're going to do it in a way, right, we're going to confess right now, we're not going to be completely original with this. Our vampires are going to be the diseased variant. We're going to treat vampirism as a disease.
Yeah.
And what we are going to include is a transference through biting.
Yes.
Not liking sunlight, not liking garlic, and their want for blood. And I think that want for blood is possibly a good starting point, because there are creatures, well, most famously a creature that does live around, that does drink blood. So happen to be called the vampire bat.
That's convenient.
Convenient, yeah. So why exactly, why a lot of bats tend to eat small insects and fruit, for example. Why does this bat go for blood? Why blood?
Insects don't have a lot of protein in them.
Really? I thought it had a lot of protein. I thought that was one of the big selling
Well, one insect on its own.
Oh,
so you have to eat lots and lots of insects in one night. Whereas this bat, it only has to have less blood in one night it has to spend less time out looking. It can just find one cow, make a little bite. They actually have an enzyme which prevents
coagulation.
The coagulation of the blood, so they can just keep drinking.
Because they don't suck the blood really.
They lap it up.
They make a little hole and kind of lap it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite sinister.
So basically, blood's got a lot of protein in it, and that basically means that it's a very easy and quick meal. My question would be though, unless this is a diabetic cow or a cow with some kind of heart problem, there's not a lot of fat content in blood, is there?
There's hardly any. That's why they have to drink almost every night, because they don't live in the warmest environment. Well, they live in South America, but they don't live directly on the equator. So they huddle together as well. They have to huddle for warmth, and they're constantly active.
Yeah. So I think this is another time to mention another thing. We're not going to have our vampires solely rely on blood, because the thing about vampire bats is they are teeny weeny. Yeah. They are very, very small, about lengthwise as long as my thumb.
Pretty much, yeah. And if a human-sized vampire were to stick a straw into your neck and just keep sucking, it would take at least 3 days to get all the blood out.
And that's just A, not efficient, and B, they would need so much more blood to survive.
Very sharp straw.
And if the vampires, because they don't suck with their fangs, like we said, they lap it up, so they would have to just keep making holes and lapping it up, and that's just not going to work really. So we're just going to straight up say they are carnivorous. However, we didn't want to completely diverge from the myth here, and we are going to say they do want blood, but not necessarily just as their main food source.
Well, what I'm going to do is something quite odd. I'm going to compare vampires to pregnant women.
Okay, so not in the vampires are pregnant. Well, why are they like pregnant women?
I take it you're familiar with pregnancy cravings.
I mean, not personally, but
together.
I'm aware there are things.
But it's quite common for a pregnant woman to have sudden bizarre cravings. There's one that's been reported a few times, which is licking coal.
I've heard about blue cheese, but I've never heard about licking coal.
Well, it's because when you've got a baby inside, well, an embryo or fetus inside you, it's going to be sort of sending signals to you so that you're going to have the craving for the things that you need to ingest to help further the development of that baby.
Okay.
So what I'm going to suggest for the vampire is that this disease, be it bacterial or viral, is that it's going to take a lot of iron out of you for its own survival.
Okay.
And then you're going to have to need to suck a lot of blood in order to replenish those iron levels.
Okay, so effectively, that's very interesting, because I always thought like pregnancy cravings was like a hormonal thing, and a lot of women just being like, oh, I just need it, I don't know why, because everyone gets cravings and stuff, but there's always that talk of weird cravings, and that actually makes a hell of a lot of sense. What it's the baby / fetus / embryo / whatever you've got in you at the time, basically sending signals to go like, right, really could do with some like carbon right now.
That's where the coal comes from.
And then that makes your brain just be like, need to lick some coal, need to lick some coal, and you don't know why, but it's your baby. It's basically your baby telling you that they need that.
Your baby is already majoring in chemistry before it's born.
Well, so basically, we're going to have our vampires have basically iron deficiency.
Pretty much, and if you were to chain up a vampire, I like to think that if you starved it for long enough, it would just become anemic.
Yeah, so just as a little silly question before we get more into the meat of this vampire discussion is, this iron deficiency would mean they would go after blood, but would it also mean they maybe like gnaw on like an iron bar?
They could easily go for broccoli.
Oh, so you could distract this vampire with some broccoli?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just pelting broccolis at vampires.
Okay, well, on the vegetable front, there is a vegetable that vampires very often are associated with for having a specific weakness to it, and that is garlic.
Yes.
Now, a lot of popular media nowadays tends to do that edgy thing of like, haha, no, I like garlic bread, even though garlic, don't be silly. Like, one thing that pops into my head is the Vampire Diaries. You like poke fun at, oh yeah, garlic's fine. Oh, crucifixes, don't be silly. Of course I can see my reflection, but yet still have the rule where they have to be invited in.
I've not seen Vampire Diaries.
It's very American.
I've watched all of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
So, so we're gonna talk about this. There's a real life allergy to garlic.
Yes.
As with most things, like peanut allergies, and there was one guy on the Great British Menu who had a oyster allergy, which I'd never heard of before. So I decided to look into garlic allergies and why people are allergic to garlic. And it comes from a chemical inside the garlic, which I'm going to butcher right now, and you're probably going to have to correct me on this, having a look at what it is now. It's diallyl disulfide.
I would pronounce it diallyl sulfide. So disulfide.
So
So you got the disulfide right.
Diallyl disulfide.
Diallyl.
Okay.
You said diallyl. That's two alleles.
Okay, diallyl disulfide. And basically, this is a chemical commonly found in garlic and in some onions, actually. So it's basically in bulbs of some plants, like onions and garlic. And there are varying severities of this disease. Like, some of it will just cause very much an upset stomach if you ingest it. But there are some people when if they make contact with garlic, or even garlic powder or vapor, they can get a severe swelling, their skin can shed, or they can even get severe third-degree burns just from making contact with garlic. Now, I couldn't actually quite believe this when I was reading it, because I was like, that's kind of hilarious that, like, the classic image of a vampire getting garlic is like, they're having garlic, like, getting near it, and they're like, their skin sizzling, and they'll be like, ah. Some people in the real world actually have that as just a thing. So, the first thing I want to talk about is if we're going to do a disease variant of vampires, vampires, is there any diseases that, in fact, like almost induce a level of allergy to stuff?
Not that I can think of. It's quite common for when you have a disease, it would somewhat affect your behaviour to suit the disease. Well, it's not for the more severe diseases. I cannot remember the names of any of them right now.
Because one thing I was thinking of is the way your immune system can be affected.
Yes.
And all allergies stem from your immune system, don't they? Would you care to explain a little bit more about that?
Yes, I think the best example is there's an island right in the middle of the Pacific, which does have an island community, and because they are so isolated from the rest of the world, they're allergic to a lot of things. But the thing is, because they live there, they don't really have to worry about peanut allergies or anything because they're just in the middle of the Pacific with no peanuts there. However, it's thought that this is where people say that there's this big allergy craze going on, because in more recent years there have been greater abilities to travel across the world in much easier times, and immigration's become a bigger thing. So it's thought that that's maybe the origin of allergies.
Okay, and it all comes down to basically your immune system reacting to a foreign body and being like, oh, no, this is dangerous. So with stuff that can affect your immune system, such as autoimmune disease or AIDS, it could, in theory, this disease could meddle with your immune system to an extent where it could give you a garlic allergy.
I think so, yeah.
And quite a severe one at that, because there is another disease which can cause a adverse effect to a very common stimuli. And not only a common stimuli, one that's linked in to vampires. And that's the disease lupus, giving you an aversion to sunlight. Now, there's actually when I was researching it, there's actually some debate in the scientific community as whether this is actually grounded in, because there has been some people with lupus who have been completely fine in the summer, and there have been some people, when they go out, they break out in hives, which are like this horrible rash you can come out with.
I was wondering why you had hives on your computer earlier. I just thought you had a condition or something.
Oh, no, I'm perfectly fine, thank God. But people with lupus can break out with hives from going in the sunlight, which is an autoimmune reaction that they probably didn't have before. So there is a chance that by gaining this vampiric disease, you could suddenly come out with third-degree burns from contact with garlic, as well as break out in hives from going in the sunlight.
It's actually thought that lupus is probably one of the origins for the myth of vampires, because when you have lupus, you do start to look a bit more vampiric. If you think about Nosferatu, that classic vampire film, he's got long fingernails and his teeth are more prominent. Yeah. He looks quite sullen. Those are some symptoms of lupus, plus the light thing. Yeah. And of course, bleeding gums is, I think, one of them. So blood in the mouth makes it look like you've been sucking blood from other people.
And whereas we can't say once you get this disease you grow fangs, because that's not really going to work. Can give them a receding gum line.
Yeah, receding gum line.
Can make their teeth a lot more prominent, for example. We could also make the nail bed receive, and also if you've got some kind of feral disease, you're not exactly going to be taking much care of your nails, I imagine. So that links into the disease that we are going to give our vampires. However, before we get into that, I think we should maybe talk about some vampires in different cultures that maybe have inspired us. So one thing you were talking about was Buffy.
Yes.
And can you tell, because I've never watched Buffy, can you tell me a little bit about the vampires in Buffy?
Okay, well they don't turn into bats. They are kind of like people, and they do the whole biting thing, but they don't suck through the fangs. They use the fangs to sort of make an open wound, and they just suck from it like we would suck on a citrus fruit. Okay. And they don't fly as well, which is quite amusing, because there was in one of the, I think it was part 2 of the first ever Buffy episode, where they said, and they just flew off, and the character said, oh, they can fly? No, that was a metaphor for driving. So
basically these are a lot more civilized vampires that gain some kind of disease.
They're somewhat grounded in reality. They've still got the reflection and the invitation thing, so there's the because it's a very mystical show, Buffy, but when it comes into the final series, they introduce the ancestral version of the vampire, which is they're said to be what Neanderthals are to us, but for vampires, which are, they're not people who are turning into these monsters. They are just savage animals that look vaguely human.
Which is kind of where we're going to be going with this, because, like I said, I mentioned Vampire Diaries earlier. You've, of course, got, at the risk of enraging some of our audience, you've got the Twilight vampires.
Never heard of that.
So you've got the Twilight vampires, you've got these Buffy vampires, and a lot of them are they're almost like people that become more murderous, for example. They're still simple, they can still drive, for example. However, we're thinking of going in a bit of a different direction to that. that and making ours. We're nowhere near the first to do this. Like I said, there was the Neanderthal vampires from Buffy. We're going to make ours a lot more savage, a lot more brutal, and a lot more willing, and a lot more animalistic in general. In order to make it so this disease is more grounded in reality, because there are a few that we can link into here, but I think that's probably best left to after a break.
Yes, let's go on a break.
So we're going to have a little break, have a bit of tea, and wrap some garlic around our necks in ready for this horrendous vampiric disease we're going to be creating after the break. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll be right back.
It's now the Monster Mash,
The Monster Mash.
and it's a graveyard
It's now
smash.
the mash.
It's caught on in a flash.
It's now the mash.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, before the break, we were talking a little bit about drinking blood, vampiric tendencies, the origin of vampires, and some of our favourite vampires in the media. Now we're back. We're going to start talking about like the way we're going to get this to spread. So we're going to do a bit of disease talk. Now, Joel, you've got a bit of a microbiology module going on at the
Yes,
moment,
I do.
don't you? So do you want to tell us a bit about diseases?
Okay, so there are, of course, different kinds of disease. The main ones that people always remember are the bacterial ones, the fungal ones, and viruses.
So that's like, a fungal one would be like athlete's foot.
Yes,
A viral one would be something like
the common cold.
the common cold, and a bacterial one, an ingrown toenail.
Well, the results of an ingrown toenail, the resulting infection that you would get from the wound.
Okay, so what's the other one? What's the last one that people often forget about?
Prions.
And for those of us who don't know, like me, what are prions?
Well, first of all, if you are infected with prions, goodbye. They are the most dangerous kind of disease, but that's the thing because they don't really crop up in humans that often. But the last big prion outbreak was mad cow disease.
So what is a prion?
It's effectively a misshapen bit of protein. Doesn't even have DNA.
So a little bit of wonky protein was the cause of mad cow disease, and what is it that makes them so dangerous?
It's simply the way they latch onto our cells, they alter them, and especially a lot of prions are good at being brain diseases.
So
That's what mad cow disease was. And there is one in humans, which I can't remember the name of. I can never remember the name of these things. I should Google before I come on here.
So what are some symptoms of like prion-related diseases?
This is going to sound a bit extreme, but insanity is one of them. Seizures, foaming at the mouth like you would get in the viral rabies.
So rabies is not prion.
Rabies is a
viral.
virus.
Okay. So how do prions get transferred then?
Through food. That's the only because they're not active like bacteria, fungus, or viruses. They are only passed through eating them. That is why mad cow disease was such a big problem because we eat cows.
Okay.
And that's why we now have DEFRA, which formed in response to mad cow disease, so that farm animals could be traced back to the farm where they came from, so that if there were to be another outbreak of mad cow disease, that could be just shut down very quickly.
Okay, so initially I was thinking, oh, prions might be the way to go because of that whole insanity idea, which would link into our feral vampires. However, if it's only from eating things, then that causes a bit of an issue. However, we do have another plan, which is rabies. Now, do you want to tell us a bit about rabies as a disease?
So we've just said it's a viral disease. It's zoonotic, and of course, as we all know, it's very easily passed through biting.
So what does zoonotic mean, sorry?
It can transfer between humans and animals.
Oh,
and of
okay.
course, usually with zoonotic diseases, other species of animal as well.
Okay, so I actually looking into this, quite hilariously, one of the biggest transferers of rabies is bats.
How vampiric of them.
How vampiric of them. And symptoms of rabies tends to be, especially in like, for example, dogs or other animals, and even in people that have got it, because of it's causing inflammation of the brain, it can cause them to act very, very feral. And as previously mentioned, it's transferred through a bite, which the whole idea of like our vampires are going to function in a fairly similar way to zombies, if this is the case.
Yeah.
As in, if they don't tear you apart and drain your blood and eat your flesh, and you happen to get away with just a bite,
You're going to get the infection.
you're going to get the infection and end up as a vampire yourself. And also, if the initial infection started from bats, then that could possibly be a very strong link into this bat mythology that vampires have. So, in terms of like, we were talking earlier about diseases affecting your immune system and causing you to have all sorts of crazy stuff happen to you that wouldn't usually happen. What kind of stuff can rabies do that would maybe make it either even more vampiric or make it distinctly like harder to control?
Well, one of the reasons why bats are one of the main transmitters, or vectors, to use the term, of rabies, is because of border control. Now, for example, normally when people talk about rabies, they think of dogs biting people, but of course we have border restrictions working on dogs, preventing dogs going from country to country, especially if they have rabies.
Yeah.
Bats are not controlled by borders, they can just fly across.
So effectively, if bats had this this vampiric disease, which made you go feral, caused you to crave blood and other iron-rich things, or possibly just attack things for food and lose your sanity as it was due to inflation of the brain, and was carried around by flying animals, not just, you said it was not just bats that could have it, because it was a zoopathical or zoonotic disease. Other animals could also transfer this.
Yes.
So our idea of a almost post-apocalyptic vampiric wasteland would possibly appear very similar to a lot of zombie movies, where there is widespread quarantined off areas full of zombies and zombie animals. Rather than this time, it would be vampires. And vampiric animals. So you could in theory get stuff like, I don't know, like a zombie gerbil.
Or a vampire puppy.
Vampire puppies, not even zombies, vampire gerbil and vampire puppies and vampire pigeons. And it would make this disease very hard to control, as well as the fact that it wouldn't... Another thing that's similar, I noticed this a lot with vampires more in I'm not sure how it works in like classical vampires, but in popular media there's a lot of like the transition into being a vampire being like one of the bigger things. That could also work with this kind of rabies-esque vampiric disease in which they get bitten and that's the bite and that's the initial thing that gets them going, and then they slowly turn down this path of losing their sanity, becoming bloodthirsty feral creatures that want nothing more than to tear you to shreds, that just so happen to hate garlic and sunlight.
Interesting. Speaking of bites, if we were to have every animal bite a human, do you know which animal bite would be the most likely to get a subsequent infection?
Human bites?
Yes.
So why is that?
Because we've got a lot of bacteria in our mouths, which should not be in our bloodstream.
So I've heard that a lot. I have actually heard that whole dogs have cleaner mouths than humans, and I always thought that was a load of rubbish because they eat their own vomit as well as fox poo and stuff like that. So has it got some truth to it?
I wouldn't necessarily say cleaner, because clean is quite a tricky word to use when talking about the animal kingdom.
Yes.
Especially when we're talking about amounts of bacteria. This is probably the amount of bacteria that are capable of surviving in humans.
So that actually plays into our hands quite happily, because the initial disease coming from bats, like rabies, helps a lot. But then if it's even more likely to transfer if a human does it, because human bites are some of the most infectious.
Yeah. And even then, if we're going to make it a virus like rabies, what somebody could do if they got bitten, you just probably automatically assume during the early days of this, before there's any proper research done into the stuff to prevent vampires existing, the first thing you would do is take a course of antibiotics. They don't work on viruses.
Of course they don't. So, on that topic, I was going to say, what are the benefits of it being a virus? Of course, it's not really a benefit to us, but why would this disease function best as a virus compared to stuff like fungal or bacterial infections?
Well, a virus is quite simple. They're much more simple than bacteria or fungus. They can spread very easily. They're harder to kill, because I just said you can't use antibiotics against them. But the way a virus works is that it latches onto a cell, inserts a ribonucleic acid stream into your cell. It stops your cell replicating, and it uses your own replicators to replicate and create more virus bodies.
Yeah.
And the cell bursts. Let's imagine it's 20. They're a lot more than 20. But say one cell bursts, 20 come out. Each of those ones then go to another cell, create 20 each. So they grow. They reproduce very fast.
Yeah. And then this also helps us a little bit in the fact that one of our when we were thinking about how we can make garlic adverse to our vampires, was its antibacterial properties, wasn't it?
Yes.
Because one of my initial thoughts was, could we use garlic to help treat a bite? But that actually makes it even more scary. That garlic only actually works once they're infected, and they've got this adverse effect to the chemicals in it. Also, in terms of, we're talking about diseases again, we're having vampirism work as a like a disease in which people are feral, they are and they one of the things is people want to find a cure for it, probably.
Yeah.
They want to find a cure for vampirism. How do we go about curing a viral infection, like a mass-spreaded vampiric disease that we've come up with here?
Well, we always talk about vaccinations. When you're at school, you'll always be taught about smallpox.
Okay.
And the way that Edward Jenner used cowpox to combat smallpox in the bloodstream.
Of course.
Because they're sort of mutated forms of each other.
Uh-huh.
So they're not that far off for you to build an immune system.
So with Edward Jenner, if I'm not mistaken, just to give a bit of context, I think the original story was cowpox. Smallpox was this horrendous disease which was
absolutely horrendous,
ravaging England and killing rich, poor, just killing everyone.
The rich were less likely to die because they were rich and didn't have to.
Oh yeah, of course,
Yeah.
but it was still very deadly.
If you got it,
and cowpox was a disease it was like chickenpox, but even milder.
Kind of, yeah.
Which was often found in milking maids, which
Yes.
is how it got like the name cowpox.
Hmm.
And he noticed that a lot of milkmaids who had cowpox didn't often get smallpox, and that was like the basis of his study, wasn't it?
Yes, he then noticed that, and he got a local boy, because in those days it was legal to experiment on them.
Yeah, of course.
And,
in surplus.
Yes, and he just sort of made an open wound in the boy and inserted a sample of cowpox, waited for him to get the cowpox, and then that was wait for him to recover. And later he infected the boy again with smallpox, and nothing happened to him.
Okay, so basically he on a whim, he gave this kid one of the most deadly diseases on the planet on the off chance that maybe his theory was right.
And actually, that's where we get do you know where we get the word vaccination from?
No, I don't.
Vacca is Latin for cow.
That's really interesting. So effectively, what we could end up seeing is people giving people a mild form of vampirism in order to try and combat mass.
Possibly, I mean, that's one of the forms of vaccination.
Mm.
Because sometimes it's harder to find a mutated form of a virus. So what would happen is you'd have to have a culture of this virus, and it would simply just be trial and error, seeing what works against it, which is a much less convenient process.
Much less convenient. But as long as you have a good amount of that distilled essence of garlic around, or just access to sunlight, that might be that you've got an pretty, I wouldn't say easy way to deal with it, but a fairly plausible way of dealing with it.
Yeah.
So on that, I think we've pretty much got it covered, don't we?
Yes, I would say so.
We have a disease carried by mostly bats, but other animals as well, which leaves people with bloodthirsty, ravaging, savage tendencies to hunt others down. But it also gives them a rather interesting weakness to garlic and other bulb vegetables, as well as light, as well as it being much easily spread through human bites, as well as other animals, and just it probably having a really adverse effect on the world in much the way that mad cow disease did.
Yeah.
And you know what, Joel?
Yeah.
I feel like if we got bitten by one of these,
We would probably die.
So thank you all very much for listening, and let's not play God.
Ha 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 ha!